Now that we have our paths all sorted out, we need to start writing code for creating items. Now, we're not going to worry about authentication at this point in time. We've already looked at that, and we should be able to easily add that to our application, because authentication is going to add some complexity as far as development is concerned. So we want to add the functionality that we need and then add authentication later, just to make our lives a little easier. So the first thing I'm going to do is inside of our admin's index view is add a link for creating a new item so that it will take us to a new page. So where we have our search form, because we don't really need that, we're going to have an A element. The href is going to be create.php. And this is going to go naturally to our create page. Now, we don't have to say admin/create, because in the browser, it's going to take our current location, which is admin, and it's going to append create.php to that. So we're going to be fine there. And let's just have create new term. And that's all that we really need now. So let's refresh. Let's make sure that that's what we have. It is. So we can go to that page. And of course, it doesn't exist. So we need a controller. So let's go to our admin folder. Let's add a new file called create.php. And let's go ahead and bring in the app and also the view. So let's open up index.php and we can just copy what we have here. And then we will paste that in. Now we, of course, don't want to get our terms, and our view is going to be called create. So let's go ahead and change that. And you know what? Let's go ahead and create our view as well. And we can just take what we have for index and copy and paste, because that will at least give us a starting point. And then that's just create.view.php. Okay, so our title is going to be create term. And then we are going to have a form. And really, we just need two things. We need the term and the definition. So let's get rid of our table, because we don't need a table here. And just looking at this, the markup's all wrong anyway. So that might be something that we go back and change. But for right now, let's focus on this. Our action is going to be to create once again. So we're going to leave that alone. And we want the method to be post, because in this case, we are changing the state of our application by modifying our data. We are creating something. So this is going to be a post request. And then let's have a form group for our fields. So the first one is going to be for the term itself. Let's have a label. The for, we'll just call it term. And then we will have an input element, type text. The name will be term, and the ID will be term. And that's good enough for me. Let's take that, copy and paste it so that we can create our other. Oh, we do need text for the label. So we will have term, and then we will have definition. And of course, the for and the name and the ID need to change. So we'll just set this as definition as well. And instead of using a text box, let's use a text area. Or I guess I should say, instead of using an input element, we will use a text area. We will still have the name and ID, but we won't have the type attribute, and we need to close this element. And that should be okay. So let's go to the browser. Let's look at what we have, and that's not the best, but we're also missing some things here. We need a class of form control for our form controls. So let's add that in, and that should make that look a little bit cleaner. So let's refresh. Okay. Our definition field could be a little bit larger, but we're just going to stick with this because we need to move on. So let's add another group for our submit button. And I'm going to use, once again, another input element. The type will be submit, and the value is going to be create term. All right, so we have our form. Now we just need to handle the code for whenever we submit this form. So the first thing that we need to do inside of our controller is check to see what type of request was made. Because if it's a post request, then we of course want to process the incoming data. Now we can do that with our server superglobal, and then we check the request method to see if it's equal to post. And I want to break this out into another function because it would be useful to just have a function that says is post so that we don't have to type this all of the time. Now notice that I'm using the strict equality now. I am going to probably be doing that from now on. And anytime that I come across just normal equality, I will probably change it. So we're going to create a function that's going to encapsulate this so that we can just call is_post. And that will, of course, return true or false. So let's go to our functions file and we will add that. So here we go. Function is_post. And we will simply return if the request method is equal to post. Easy enough. So now we can do something with the incoming data. We have the term and the definition. We need to start sanitizing and validating our input. So we're going to start doing that. And to help do that, I'm going to write a function called sanitize. That's going to strip out anything that is harmful to our application because we're going to take that input and then display it in the browser. So therefore, we want to sanitize it. And we're going to pass in the value from our post. So we're getting the term there. We need to also get the definition. So we will do that. And the sanitize function is going to return one of two things. It's going to give us the sanitized value, or it's going to give us an empty string. The reason why it would give us an empty string is because the filtering might have failed. So in that case, what we're going to do is then check to see if term or definition is empty. So we'll do that. And if that is the case, then we of course want to send a message back to the user saying, nuh-uh, you've got to supply something that is valid to us. So we'll just add a to-do there, a display message, and we'll come back to that at a later time. So let's write this sanitize function. We'll go to our functions file, function sanitize. We'll call the parameter value for the lack of a better term. And we'll create a variable and we'll call a function called filter var. Now this is similar to what we've used in a previous lesson. I don't remember if it was filter input or validate input. It was one of those, and this is essentially the same thing, except that instead of supplying the type of input, like the get request or the post request, we are supplying a variable. This way we have a little bit more flexibility so that we could, do this. We can just pass in our value. And then we have that value as a variable so that we could use sanitize for anything and it wouldn't be dependent upon a particular type of input. So we need to pass two things. First is the variable that we want to filter. The second is the type of filter that we want to do. Well, in this case, we want to sanitize. So that's called filter _sanitize _string. But something else that we should do is trim our value, because when the user submitted the form, they could have typed in a couple of spaces and then whatever the term is. And whenever you trim a string, you trim off any leading or ending white space, because we don't want any white space at the beginning or ending of our term or the definition. So we can call a function called trim, and we'll pass in our value. And then the result of that is going to be used for our filter var. Now, the filter var function returns one of two things. It gives us either our filtered string or it returns false if the filter failed. So let's do a check for false. And if it is false, then we will simply return an empty string. Otherwise, we will return our value. So that inside of our controller, we have already set up so that if term or definition is empty, then either the filter failed or the user submitted an empty string or a string of just white space to begin with. So we're catching that and we'll display a message. Otherwise, we want to save our new term and definition. So we have several functions. Let's first of all look at what we have. So that was inside of app data file functions. We have get terms, get term, search terms. We can call this simply add term. So add underscore term, we can pass in our term and the definition, and then we will be good. And then whenever we add a term, we really should redirect back to the index. So we will redirect back to index, and we'll see which index that actually takes us to, either in the admin or at the root of our project. And well, we die there anyway, so we'll be good to go there. So we just need to write our add term function. So inside of our file functions, we will say function add term. And the first thing we want to do is get our terms, because we are going to take the incoming information and then add that to our array. Now remember that our terms is an array of objects. So we in turn need to change our term and our definition into an object. And we can do that in a couple of different ways. The first way would be to simply just write a class, and we will eventually get there. But for now, we're going to create an array. And the key, or the keys rather, are going to be what we've been using. Term is going to have the value of term, and then definition is going to have the value of course, definition. And then we want to convert this array into an object. So I'm going to create a new variable called obj. And then we do this. We have a pair of parentheses. We put object inside of the parentheses, and then we specify the array. So this is converting or casting the array into an object. And then we need to add that object to our items. And we do that like this. We have an array. So we specify the square brackets, but we don't put anything inside of the square brackets. And we say equal object. So this is going to add that object at the end of our items array. And then we simply want to write that data. So we have a function called getData. We'll call setData. We'll pass in our items, and then that function will be responsible for writing to the file. So we can simplify this a little bit. We don't really need this array variable. So instead we can take our array and just do this. It's a little bit more cryptic to read, but I like that better. So let's write this set data. Let's go down, function set data. We're going to get our items, but let's call this array because that's what we have. And the first thing we want to do is get our file name. So let's do that as well. And then we will get our JSON. We are essentially going to do the opposite of what we're doing here. So instead of JSON being an empty string, we're going to serialize our array. And whenever we decoded the JSON, we used JSON underscore decode. The opposite is JSON underscore encode. We pass in our array that gives us a JSON structure, and then we simply write that to the file. So we're going to use file put contents. We don't need to check if it exists, because if it doesn't, it's going to create that file anyway. We pass in the name of the file that we want to write to. We pass in the data that we want to write, our JSON structure, and that's it. So let's make sure that inside of our controller, we are adding the term. We are. So let's see if this works. Let's go to the browser. Let's type in JSON, and that's JavaScript object notation. If we click on create term, that should redirect us to index, which it does. And that was inside of admin. And we now have added the JSON item. So if we click on JSON, then, well, we don't have the detail there. But if we go back to just the root of our project and click on JSON, we see the detail there. So we now have the code for creating an item. In the next lesson, we will add the code for editing an item.